Good morning, folks. I hope you've had time to read through Matthew 22 this morning. We're jumping into this passage. As we do so, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever walked into a room where there's a really tense atmosphere? Maybe you've just walked in after an argument and you can cut the atmosphere with a knife, and you know there's this polarized tension in the air. And that's kind of the situation that we're stepping into as we step into Matthew 22. If we go back, if we rewind one verse, the last verse of Matthew 21, we see the Pharisees grouping together and starting a conspiracy to get Jesus arrested. They just are so intent on getting him silenced. And that's the tension in the air as we start Matthew 22. And Jesus kicks off by telling a parable of the wedding banquet. And in this parable, he kind of casts his opponents as ungracious people who are invited to this incredible wedding feast, but they just callously disregard the host's hospitality. And it's a clear sign of how these opponents are invited to be part of the amazing thing that God is doing, but they are disregarding it. And then we start in verse 15. It says the Pharisees lay a trap for Jesus. And what starts is an incredibly intense Q&A session where they bring out their best minds and they field the best questions that they think can entrap Jesus, can trip him up and get him to say something incriminating. Again and again, there's this tag team of different factions throwing out these questions, trying to bait Jesus and get him on the hook. First of all, there's the Pharisees who collaborate with the Herodians. And they ask Jesus a question about paying taxes. Then the Sadducees come out and they ask a question about marriage in heaven. And then the Pharisees come back with what is the greatest commandment? And that's really where I want us to focus on Matthew 22 verse 35. It says, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. It's incredible, I think, how Jesus is under this intense pressure, under intense scrutiny, and they're throwing their most sneaky questions at him. And not only is it an epic fail in terms of Jesus' opponents, because they don't succeed in getting Jesus to incriminate himself, but actually under this incredible pressure and scrutiny, Jesus says some of the most profound words that can inform our faith. You know, we all have an onboard kind of rating system for what we value in life, what we value in our lives. If you've bought anything online, quite often you're given the opportunity of rating something and sharing just what you feel about it. I've done a bit of craft here and I've created a 5-star rating system. And you know, I wonder if we were to stop and ask the question from that perspective, in our hearts, what is the rating that we give to God? Are we giving God a 5-star rating in our hearts? You think of all the things that we love in our lives. Are we giving God a 5-star rating in our hearts? And then beyond what we love, there's what we worship. We were created hardwired with the ability to worship. And if we live the way we are created to, then we will worship the one true God. But the sad fact is that we can all fabricate idols when we love things to the extent of worship in our hearts. And I wonder, the challenge from Jesus for all of us this morning is, do we give God that 5-star worship focus in our hearts? Or are we worshipping other things? And then there's our minds. What is our thought pattern? Do we have a 5-star thought pattern at focusing on God's goodness? Thinking of all that he has done for us? Or do we just disregard God and live almost as functioning atheists? Do we love God with all our hearts, soul and mind? And then we think about how we treat others. Do we have a 5-star rating of love and consideration towards our neighbours, those that we don't know, those that are less those that are more vulnerable than we are? Do we love our neighbours as ourselves? I wonder if we're to turn it around this morning, as God looks into our lives this morning, how would He rate the love of our hearts? How would He rate the worship of our souls? How would He rate the thought patterns of our minds? How would He rate the way we treat our neighbours, the way we treat the least in our society? That's a challenge for us to live with this morning.